Go. All right, so we're still talking about biological diversity. Just the sheer fact that there are enormously large numbers of living things in this planet. There are millions of possible ways to be alive. And we've talked about archaea and bacteria. Everybody else that we have to talk about in this class have cells that have nuclei. That's that bag of DNA inside, as well as a lot of organelles, little substructures that do different things. This happens to be a human white blood cell. And what I'm outlining with the pen right now, this kind of grainy U-shaped blob, that's the nucleus. Right there, that's the bag full of DNA. And then surrounding the nucleus, there's lots of little bits and bobs and deedly bobs and thingamahoochers. We don't need to get into what those are right now, but those are organelles scattered all through the cell. Eukaryotes have these very compartmentalized cells that prokaryotes don't. For our purposes, we can divide eukaryotes, the domain Eukarya, into 4 kingdoms: animals, ooh, look, computer animation, and plants, which I presume you already know, fungi, which include mushrooms, as well as things like yeast and molds and mildews, things like that. And these first 3 are mostly, there's a couple of exceptions that we'll see, multicellular, made up of more than one cell. The simplest animals, the simplest one I can think of consists of 64 cells at one stage in its life cycle. You consist of roughly 37 trillion, give or take a bit. Of course, it's different for each person. So that's multicellularity. And to some extent, they show cell differentiation, which just means that there are different cell types that are specialized to do different things. The cells that make up your skin don't have the same role as the cells that make up your islets of Langerhans in your pancreas, this little organ nestled into the curve of your intestines. Those cells don't have the same function as the Purkinje cells in your brain, and those don't have the same function as your cardiac muscle cells that make your heart beat, and so on. Those 37 trillion cells that make up you are divided into roughly 200 different basic types. A much simpler animal like a sponge, let's say, SpongeBob, SpongeBob is made of maybe roughly 10 cell types. But that fact that different types of cells are specialized for different functions is something you find in animals and in plants, and arm wave, not quite so much, but it will do in fungi. The 4th kingdom that we'll talk about here is affectionately known as the protista, known in regular English as protists. What you're looking at is a picture taken through the microscope of a very common single-celled protist. It happens to be called paramecium. There's a chance that you'll see it in lab 2 next week. You might actually get to have a look at it. And the protista is where we put all the eukaryotes that aren't animals, plants, or fungi. This is not really a good way of classifying things. It's a little bit like, imagine you wanted to study the history of all of the countries in the world except for Canada, Botswana, and Ukraine, right? That's kind of a weird way of doing it, right? You wouldn't study all of the world that isn't these three countries. It's the same in biology. We don't really study, we can't really meaningfully talk about all of the eukaryotes except for the ones that happen to be animals, plants, or fungi. We now divide the protista up into multiple kingdoms. If you really want to know the details, change your major and take biology 4401. That's invertebrate zoology, where we cover this. For what we need to do here, we can kind of keep the protista on, although you should know that it's not nearly as good a kingdom as the other three. It's kind of the place where we put all kinds of very different critters. Okay, responding to the chat, I'm glad someone thinks paramecium's cute. I'm pretty impressed myself. Okay, and the protista includes single-celled eukaryotes, and it includes multi-celled eukaryotes. This is a picture taken through a microscope of single-celled green algae with the rather long name Chlamydomonas. Not climate a bonus. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the transcript, and every so often it kind of mangles things. But this is a single-celled protist. It's green, and like green plants, it's photosynthetic, meaning it harnesses solar energy to run its metabolism. And there may be lots of them in green pond water in the summers. This is a multi-celled protist. It's also green, and if you saw it floating in Lake Conway, as sometimes you do, it would look kind of like very fine green hair. But it's multi-celled because it's made up of these box-shaped cells. I'm drawing a box around one right now. And each box is connected to two others, and this protist grows in these long filaments of cells, one cell after another. So that's a multi-celled protist. It happens to be called Spirogyra, which was also the name of a pretty good jazz fusion band back in the 70s. And then this thing is a multicellular protist. I'm drawing a blank on what it's called, but it's a green seaweed growing on a rocky coastline, and it looks plant-like. It's technically not a true plant because it is multicellular, but it doesn't have much cellular differentiation. Cells are not, if you could look at a piece of this under the microscope, the cells would not look very different from each other. They do have some differentiation. This is not always a really hard and fast rule. Getting more into that would take more time than we've got. So I'm going to kind of arm wave a little bit. But let's just say here that this is a multi-cell protist, but we still don't put it in with the plants. We put it in with the protista because it's got little cell differentiation. And so there are some protists that can be quite large. Seaweeds are a good example. I'm trying not to hit you with too much vocabulary, but you are going to see these words again. Some protists are, the word we use is autotrophic. Trophane is Greek for to feed, and autos means yourself. So autotrophic organisms feed by themselves, and that means that they fuel their metabolism with energy from the sun, and they're able to take solar energy and use that to take in small molecules like carbon dioxide and use that to build bigger molecules. There are there are some prokaryotes that are autotrophs that don't use solar energy. We don't have time to go into how those work, but most of the autotrophs that you'll ever encounter are light-using autotrophs. They feed on sunlight and use that to build up large molecules from small ones. And this is what green plants do. Autotrophic protists are commonly called algae. Other protists are heterotrophic, which just means feeding on others. Hetero means other. And they get their energy from eating things, eating other living things, and breaking down their large molecules. They're able to get energy from that process. This is the same way that you make a living. You're heterotrophic. You get your energy and your living matter from eating food. And you'll often see the word protozoa used for heterotrophic protists. And then mixotrophic protists can do both. They might live either autotrophically or heterotrophically, or they might even go both at once. So this, for example, is a mixotrophic protist seen under the microscope. It's called Euglena, Euglena gracilis. It's photosynthetic like a plant. You can see it's got that green color, but it also is an active swimmer. And if you deprive it of light, if you put it in darkness for a while, it's actually quite capable of consuming food. You can't see it clearly, but at the end, at the upper right, it's got this little food groove that it can literally open up and swallow things with it. So this is just an example of a mixotroph. Now, whenever I say mixotroph, I always think we ought to call this thing Sir Mixotroph, because it says something like, I use the sun photosynthesize, but I also eat other guys. Get it? He's a mixotroph, Sir Mixo. Never mind, he was probably before your time. Okay. This is a small sample of protists that you could find floating in the ocean. Most of what you're looking at are single-celled photosynthetic protists. Some of them are multi-celled. You can find these in humongous numbers in fertile parts of the ocean. You could find them in lakes. You could find them in Lake Conway on a nice sunny, warm day. And living things that do this, we call phytoplankton. Plankton does not refer to that thing that looks like a pill that runs the Krusty Krab. Plankton refers to any living thing that floats in the water but can't swim, or at least can't swim well enough that it can, that it's free from the influence of currents. Plankton goes where the currents go. And phyto is a root we use for plant. So the phytoplankton is any living thing that is an autotroph and just floats in the water. Anything that makes the water of the pond green when you look at it in the summer is going to be phytoplankton. A lot of protists are in the zooplankton, that's free floating anything that eats other things, other living things. And protists like this are a critical source of food for larger organisms. Small fish would eat these, crustaceans, little shrimpies would eat those. In Lake Conway, floating phytoplankton like this would probably get eaten by little crustaceans. Those might get eaten by small fish like gizzard shad. Those might get eaten by larger fish like bass and crappie. And so without these critters at the base of what we call the food web, you don't get any life. This is what supports the little crustaceans and the little fish and the big fish, and ultimately the crappie that my across the street neighbor never seems to be able to catch. There are protists that cause significant human diseases. On the left, these are both pictures of human blood samples, and the round things are just human blood cells. On the left, you can see that among the round blood cells, we have these curvy things. I'm circling one with the red pen right there. That's a protist. You can see the nucleus in the middle of it. In the genus Trypanosoma, that causes African sleeping sickness. It causes severe disease of cattle called Nagana. There's a similar one in South America that causes a chronic illness called Chagas disease. And then on the right, these round pink things are human red blood cells. And looking inside some of these cells, they have these little purple blobs, some of which look almost like little rings. I'm circling some right now. Those are some very small protists in the genus Plasmodium. Those infect your blood cells and they cause the disease malaria. Malaria is not something that most of us have ever worried about. It's not completely gone from Arkansas, but there's something like 10 cases a year in the whole state. But globally, it's one of the killers. Globally, the last statistic I saw was that it kills something like 440,000 people worldwide every year, most of them children. So this thing is bad, and there are ongoing efforts to find better drugs and get them to the people that need them. And there's progress that's been made recently on vaccines, but this is still a pretty difficult problem for public health in countries where malaria is endemic. There's other protists that cause plant diseases. Some of you might be here because of a protist called Phytophthora infestans. This is what it looks like under the microscope on the left. On the right is what it does to potatoes. An outbreak of Phytophthora infestans in the 1840s in Ireland killed most of the potato crop that the rural poor farmers of Ireland absolutely depended on. Well over 1 million Irish people starved, and over 1 million more emigrated, many to this country. So if you've got Irish ancestry in the United States, you may well have ancestors that came here because they were starving and desperate and had to escape the potato famine. And the potato blight was caused by a protist, Phytophthora infestans. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about protists. I could say a whole lot more, but this will have to do. And we'll move over to the fungi. Most fungi under the microscope look like this. They're made up of a mass of filaments, and each filament is called a hypha, H-Y-P-H-A. Since this is a Latin word, it's got an odd plural. The plural form is hyphae. And each hypha is made up of many cells. And the whole thing is surrounded by a cell wall. And we talked about cell walls in the context of bacteria. Archaea have them too, by the way. Bacterial cell walls are made of this stuff called peptidoglycan. Fungal cell walls are made up of a different substance, one called chitin. C-H-I-T-I-N, chitin. And here's a big mass of hyphae. As the hyphae grow, they branch and branch and branch again. And if you have ever left food in the fridge for way too long and taken it out and noticed that it's suddenly gotten fuzzy, right? You have what looks like cotton balls growing on the surface of your food. You've seen this thing before. These masses of hyphae, make these, okay, somebody said flavor, ew. Make these cottony growths on spoiled food, and a mass of hyphae we call a mycelium. So what you're looking at is a big mycelium. This is the way that most fungi grow. I remember the time that I was in the shower and I looked up and I noticed that we had patches of fuzzy growth on the ceiling. So I said, "Hey, there's a mycelium on my ceiling." And I laughed because it was funny. And I'm assuming you're all just falling out of your chairs laughing at your professor's incredible wit. Right. Now, here's the thing. Fungi growing as mycelia are extremely common. They're not that easy to observe because you find lots of them in places like decaying wood. If you have a rotten log or an old tree trunk that's starting to crumble and get fragile, what's going on with it is that there is fungal mycelia growing all through that dead wood, pushing its way through and breaking down and absorbing the dead wood. And this is a process that might take many years. Eventually, that mycelium is going to soak up all of the dead wood, and what's left is just going to crumble into dirt. It's the same in soil. Every little pinch of good soil has fungal mycelia growing through it, breaking down dead leaves and old roots and all kinds of things in the soil. But you may never see all of that mycelium because it's hard to see when it's all buried, twining its way, in between soil particles. But in many fungi, the hyphae will, as they grow, will periodically start forming this kind of tight tangle webbing together, and that web will thicken and it will put up a reproductive structure called a sporocarp. And what you're looking at here is a home mushroom farm seen from the side. All that white cottony stuff in the lower part is mycelium, and strands of mycelium have come together, kind of tangled together, and they are growing these little kind of thumb-shaped, they're called buttons, pushing out of the soil, and those will grow, expand, and eventually form mature mushrooms, which will get picked and, I don't know, put on pizza or something like that, whatever you do with mushrooms. And as I mentioned, fungi are incredibly abundant in soils. Any piece of soil is going to have fungi in it. The problem is you can't easily see the mycelium because it's all underground. And the only way you might know that a mycelium is there, because that mycelium will periodically send up sporocarps. What you're looking at here is something I've seen before. I did not take this picture, but every so often after a good spring rain, you can spot these on the lawns of some of the older houses in Conway. This is called a fairy ring. Probably not because the story is that fairies would come out at night and dance around in a ring and the mushrooms would sprout where the fairies were dancing. No doubt because fairies wear boots, at least according to Ozzy Osbourne. What's really happening is that whole circular patch of soil has a particular fungus growing in it as a mycelium. And at the edges of the patch of soil where the mycelium is growing, that mycelium is sending up a whole bunch of sporocarps. So all of the soil inside that circle has been colonized by the mycelium of a particular species of fungus. That mycelium, if you could see it, would look exactly like the mycelium growing on your spoiled food, but you can't see it because it's woven into the soil itself. You could never dig it out the way you could with a plant. The largest known living thing in the world is actually a single fungal mycelium that covers 220 acres, or if you prefer, that's 890 hectares. It works out to more than 6 times the size of the UCA campus. And that's one single network of hyphae, all connected to each other, all growing as one huge unit through the soil of the Malheur National Forest in Oregon. This is not a picture of this largest fungus, but it shows you a relative. The picture is an aerial photo of a forest in Montana, and like right there where I'm circling, and right there, those patches that look kind of grayish from the air are areas where the trees are growing poorly and starting to die. And it's because these particular trees have been invaded by a fungus mycelium that doesn't just grow in soil, it penetrates the tree roots and causes disease. And each one of those areas of impaired tree growth is caused by one mycelium. The larger patches are about 20 acres in size. By the way, if you're not clear on how big an acre is an American football field from one 5-yard line to the opposite 5-yard line. So take a regulation American football field, cut off the end zones, and cut off about 5 yards from each end, and that's an acre. So each one of these spots is about, let's call it 16 football fields in size. Pretty big. On the other hand, there are fungi that don't form hyphae. We call these yeast, and that's what yeast look like under the microscope. Each one of these oval things right there is a single cell. And these are fungi that don't form hyphae. You probably know the baker's yeast that gets added to bread dough to make it rise. Yeast are used in baking a lot. This is a yeast that can cause human infections. I used to see this when I worked at the Berkeley Free Clinic because it can cause vaginal infections. It can also infect the mouths, usually of newborns. And what you're looking at is a slide of vaginal discharge, and the yeast is stained very dark, and you can see some of these oval single-celled stages. But you can also see some areas where the yeast is forming hyphae because this particular yeast can switch it. That particular yeast can go back and forth between a hyphal stage and a single-celled stage. It's called Candida albicans, and again, it can cause various human diseases. And we call it a yeast, but it can grow as hyphae as well. It can do both. I'm not going to say that much about how fungi have sex. What you're looking at is 2 mycelia in the process of seriously getting it on. And what happens is that when 2 mycelia grow close to each other, if the mycelia are, fungi don't have genders as we think of them, but they do have different mating types, although the mating types don't look different from each other physically. But when 2 hyphae of mating types get together, they join together like this. Each one of these is the tip of one hypha that's come together. They mingle genetic material. They mix their DNA together, which is what sex is all about, and produce a new hypha that's got the DNA of both of them. And the sexual hypha gets longer, and then it divides and it produces a bunch of single-celled fungus spores. Those will fall off and drift away with the wind. And if they land in a place that's got a good environment for them, each spore can sprout into a new hypha and ultimately produce a new mycelium. So over here on the right, each one of these oval things will eventually break off and go drifting away on the wind. And if it happens to drift onto an environment that's got the right kind of nutrients and all that, it will produce a new mycelium. In many species of fungi, those sexual hyphae are what produce sporocarps. There are some fungi like black bread mold where the sexual hyphae don't make sporocarps. But certainly in the case of mushrooms, it's those sexual hyphae that grow and branch and divide and web together and produce these sporocarps. These are some Armillaria honey fungi growing at the base of the tree. By the way, some species of this mushroom are quite delicious, but you have to be able to recognize them because there are some deadly mushrooms that look a lot like them. There's no simple test that you can use to tell whether a mushroom is poisonous or not. You just have to be able to recognize the species. Anyway, mushrooms are a type of sporocarp that you're probably familiar with. This is another type of sporocarp that you'll see around here. I actually took this one afternoon years ago when my kid was running around like a maniac at Laurel Park. If you don't know, that's the park that is kind of on the other side of Conway Regional Hospital from the UCA campus. They had a tree that was attacked by fungi, and the fungus was growing all through the wood of the tree. You can't really see the actual mycelium because it's made up of these tiny microscopic threads that penetrate the wood. But what you can see are the sporocarps that this mycelium puts out, and they look like little shelves. So the common name for these are shelf fungi or bracket fungi. And you get a lot of these on wood. You get a lot of these on old trees. You get a lot of these on dead wood. You can see them all over the place if you know what you're looking for. They're very common in any wooded area in Arkansas or just about anywhere. If you go looking, you might encounter, there's other types of sporocarps, so-called coral fungi, which kind of look like little branching things. Truffles, which are sporocarps that are completely buried underground. Puffballs, which if you squeeze a mature puffball, it'll shoot out a bunch of spores. Morels are absolutely delicious if you know where to find them. And if you know where to find them, you don't tell anybody else because that's your patch. Jelly fungi you can sometimes see on dead tree branches. They look like little, blobs of jelly. That's all fungi. Lots of different species of fungi, some of them with very different shapes of sporocarps. Incidentally, fungi that don't engage in sexual reproduction, at least as far as we know, get lumped together in a group called imperfect fungi, or just fungi imperfecti. And the only reason I bring this up is that the fungi imperfecti include species that cause human disease. So the fungus that causes athlete's foot is a fungus that gives you the symptoms by growing in and among your outer skin cells, breaking them down as a food source, and ultimately causing them to flake off, giving you, itchy feet. The fungi that cause jock itch are pretty closely related. Those are fungi that are growing in and among and around the cells in the outer layer of skin in your crotch, breaking them down and causing irritation and itchiness. Ringworm is another fungus skin infection. It's not really a worm, it's a fungus that tends to make these ring-shaped patches of rash on your skin. And you need to take these, you need to take these seriously. Jock itch, after all, is what killed Captain Hook. Fungi that get deeper into the body can actually be very dangerous, especially if your immune system is damaged. What you're looking at here is a sample from the lungs of somebody infected with a yeast, and it's been stained, and every one of these dark gray round ball-shaped objects right there is the cell of a yeast. I'm circling some so that you can see what we're looking at. Those yeast belong to a species called Pneumocystis urevechii, and it's important because it can cause severe pneumonia, frequently lethal, in patients that have full-blown AIDS. People that are infected with the HIV virus, what that virus does is take your immune system down, and you don't really die from the virus itself. You die from infections that your body is no longer able to fight off. And this is one of them. People with healthy immune systems rarely get yeast infections of the lungs because your body's able to fight and kill and get rid of the yeast. And we'll talk later as to how your body does that. But people with immune syndromes like AIDS, people on immunosuppressive drugs, like people who have gotten organ transplants or have autoimmune diseases, can be more prone to severe fungal infections, and this is one of them. On the other hand, there's other fungi that are quite useful to humans. There are species of yeast that have a nice trick. If you feed them sugar, they'll break it down, and their byproducts are the gas, carbon dioxide, and a liquid called ethyl alcohol. So if you take a sugary liquid like grape juice or apple juice, or a liquid made out of grain that has just begun to sprout, all of those have lots of sugars. Turn yeast loose on those liquids, and they'll break down the sugar into carbon dioxide gas and ethyl alcohol, and that's how you get wine, cider, or beer. Yeast is also added to bread for the same reason. If you take some bread dough with sugar and you add yeast, the yeast break down the sugar, they produce bubbles of carbon dioxide gas, and they make the bread rise, and they give you a light, fluffy piece of bread instead of a dense cracker. By the way, those yeasts do make alcohol, but the baking process usually makes that alcohol evaporate. That's why you don't get drunk from eating bread. In theory, you could get drunk by eating lots of raw bread dough. I would not recommend it. You'd probably make yourself sick. So yeah, don't really do it. You just get a really bad stomach ache before you felt any other after effects. And yeah, someone pointed out in the chat, yeast is also known as leaven, and bread that's made without yeast is called unleavened bread. You might know that's mentioned in the Old Testament of the Bible. At the Passover meal in Judaism, people still eat cracker-like bread called matzah that's made without yeast. There's also, of course, plenty of edible mushrooms. Edible truffles are quite a delicacy and extremely expensive. You've got fungus fermented foods. In particular, fungus fermented soybean curd is how you get tofu, and miso in Japanese cooking. You can also add fungi to certain food products to add flavor. Blue cheese starts out as a white cheese, and it's deliberately inoculated with a particular fungus that grows through the cheese. And as it breaks down the cheese, it creates this particular flavor that people tend to like. So if you've ever eaten blue cheese, you've eaten a fungus fermented food. You can even grow certain fungi to make protein-rich meat substitutes. They're sold under the trade name Quorn, and I took this picture a few years ago in my local Kroger. You could buy this at the supermarket today. It is a type of fungus grown in a vat and harvested, and that mycelium can be processed into something with the texture and flavor of meat. And last but not least, fungi produce a number of antibiotics. Most antibiotics can't be used as medicine because they are as poisonous to you as they would be to the bacteria. But useful antibiotics, the most famous one would be penicillin, and various derivatives of it like ampicillin, cephalosporin, cloxacillin, things like that you might have taken at some point. Those are fungus produced. They were discovered starting in, I think, 1925, when a scientist named Alexander Fleming found a fungus growing in his lab next to some bacteria and happened to notice that the fungus was blocking the bacterial growth. It was an accidental discovery that went on to save millions of lives. And on that note, it is 10:50, so I am going to stop the recording now.